All right. Welcome to this afternoon's American Security Project webinar. This is an on-the-record conversation that will be available for attribution. A recording of this conversation will be posted on our website and sent to those who registered for the event. All audience members will be muted during the discussion. And with that, Patrick, to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Adam. I'm Patrick Costello, the Chief Executive Officer of the American Security Project. Things are getting very tense in the standoff between Ukraine and the West and Russia. There are a lot of moving parts. Russia continues to amass troops along the Ukrainian border in occupied Crimea and in Belarus. There's also a lot of diplomatic activity. It's all been quite dizzying. Joining us this afternoon to try and make sense of it all is Vivian Salama of the Wall Street Journal. Vivian is a national security reporter for the Journal. She's covered U.S. foreign policy and national security issues for nearly 2 decades, reporting from more than 75 countries. And her most recent trip was in Ukraine, where she was reporting from the ground. So Vivian, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time. So to start, as I mentioned, there's a lot of moving parts here, but to set a baseline, can you just tell us how big Russia's military buildup is, where their forces are concentrated, just to give us a sense of what the military balance is?
Hey, Patrick, it's so great to be with you guys, and definitely a lot to unpack with this issue. So Russia's military buildup in recent months was believed to be around the number of about 100,000, and that number is on the rise. We believe that according to satellite images, according to intel reports, including a number of different sourcing, it's believed to be as high as 130,000 now, which is obviously very alarming. But Russia's aggression and military buildup has sort of ebbed and flowed for 8 years now, since it invaded Crimea, since it annexed Crimea in 2014, and has sort of fomented this separatist war that's been on a low boil since 2014 in Donbass. And so this particular buildup has been alarming for a number of reasons. A, because of the fact that it's pretty much been consistent. It started in April, and then it sort of waned and they pulled back, and it started again in October, and it's been pretty consistent since then. But a couple of different elements here that have made this sort of a unique situation. First of all, we do see, based on satellite images, which we can actually talk about the satellite images and how it's lent a very interesting and different dynamic to this whole conflict. But the satellite images are showing now that they're starting to move things like medical units, field hospitals, and things like that, that suggest that an attack could be imminent, that it's more than just a bluff, which is what the Ukrainian government maintains and still was telling me as recently as a week ago, that they believe that it could be a bluff and just an intimidation factor. But there's also the element of troops now in Belarus to the north of Ukraine, which has been extremely alarming for US officials, certainly, who have been waving red flags about this now for about a month. Not least of all because of the fact that it places Russian troops now within about 50 kilometers from Kiev, the capital, but also it essentially means that the country is half encircled. You have the Black Sea and Sea of Azov with warships kind of floating around. Obviously, the Crimean Peninsula is run by Russia, and so they've got that advantage to the south, to the east, outside of Donbass, and then to the north as well. And so that is really why the situation currently, according to Western officials, begs for a different level of alert, being alert, alarm, and just urgent need to de-escalate.
So you talk about the ebbs and flows, and in thinking about the 8 years of low intensity conflict between Russia and Ukraine, I think the latest chapter really does start around April, when Russia was conducting military exercises along their border with Ukraine. I believe the troop numbers were somewhere in the same ballpark, probably right around 100,000. But they then went home. Lavrov said that those were just military exercises within Russia's own territory, and then the troops were, basically sent back to their home units. But how do you see the events of April, the exercises, and the material left behind as setting the stage for the crisis in which we currently find ourselves?
It's entirely possible that that was the beginning of what we see right now, although they did fall back largely at the time. And they insisted all along that they were war exercises. They were very critical of the criticism they were receiving, saying it's nobody's place to tell us what to do on our own territory. And so they were really insistent that these were just war exercises. By the way, they still maintain that these are just war exercises in Belarus and to the east. And also assert that it's really none of the West's business as far as what they do. Belarus is an ally of Russia, and they have the full blessing of Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, who is a strong Putin ally. And so they say, you know, we're not doing anything wrong. Obviously, the Ukrainians feel otherwise, and a number of countries on the eastern flank of Europe feel very differently because of the fact that they now believe that these threats, and particularly the buildup of troops in Belarus, is a direct threat. And so you see now US troops repositioning in places like Poland, in places like Romania. There's a lot of talk about reinforcing the Baltic nations now, all in response to some of these movements. But essentially, all along to this day, the Russians assert that they're not doing anything wrong, that this is not part of an invasion plan, that these are military exercises that are very standard. And they point to the fact that just as the West, just as NATO conducts military exercises in Europe, so too do they have the right to conduct their own military exercises. And so this is a bit of the back and forth that we've seen play out since last April.
Let's talk about some of these satellite images that you just brought up. Some that I've seen, they show that the Russian troops are along the border with Ukraine but they're in soft tents, so they're relatively exposed to the elements. There has been the movement of, medical units and the like into the area. And I'm just curious if for how long can this go on, given the strain that it would have on Russia's own readiness? Like, is this a matter of weeks in which this all has to come to a head?
Well, it does have to come to a head theoretically, because as military experts point out, the ideal time for a Russian invasion to take place is when the ground is frozen. And there are pretty much only a number of weeks left for that to take place. And so that is believed to be one of the reasons why we're still kind of waiting on pins and needles to see if anything happens. Military exercises have just begun. A renewed phase of military exercises in Belarus have just begun yesterday. And so also a number of people watching to see if that sort of escalates from exercises into forward movements. And then finally, the Olympics as being the key element that has been lingering over a lot of this. President Putin and President Xi met last week, this week. Everything is blurred. I'm sorry, but it was this week, I guess. And there's a number of observers feel that it was probably likely that Putin was asked, can you just kind of slow your roll for a minute and wait until we get through these Olympics, at least as a courtesy to China if he decides to invade. And so, as far as whether or not these medical units and everything suggest, it is certainly the making of an invasion. He's certainly ready at this point, and that's what US officials are now telling us in the last 2 weeks, especially, and European officials too, is that he's now in a position to invade. And he has all the elements, and that includes the medical tents and everything else you see, sort of the making of an invasion is now in place. Whether or not it's just a bluff, again, this is what the Ukrainian officials were telling me all along, is he's the master of deception. And this is part of it, is that he's going to stage it and make it look exactly like an invasion. He will sit there and he will intimidate and make everyone nervous, but he won't actually invade. Whether or not he does is the big, $1 million question. US officials say, you do not want to be taking a chance at this point because he could move very quickly at any minute at this stage.
Right. I want to get into your recent trip to Ukraine, but before we get into that, I'm just thinking about all the diplomatic machinations, and kind of, in the words of Churchill, it's better to jaw than war. And there's a lot of jawing going on. So could you try and bring us up to speed on the latest diplomatic moves? Tell us a bit about the most recent diplomatic efforts.
Well, the most recent is President Macron of France, who has been shuttling between capitals, Moscow and Kiev, trying to somehow broker any kind of effort to renew diplomatic efforts, especially with regard to the Minsk agreement and the Normandy Protocol that was agreed upon post 2014. France and Germany had taken the lead on that. And so it's no surprise that France is now trying to reassert itself and bring back the state of those talks. But, he left saying, President Putin assured me that he would not escalate beyond this point. But at the same time, I'm not naive and I recognize that, he's going to do what he's going to do. And so we can only hope. And at this point, the Americans are sort of in that same ballpark of just we can only hope. Diplomatic efforts, I think US officials have been telling me now for almost 2 months that they don't have a lot of faith in the potential for a breakthrough. Both sides extremely bound to their terms, and no one is willing to make concessions. At the same time, they say, as long as we can kick this down the road, that is a victory, essentially. We're talking now about the ground being frozen and tanks not really being able to move with as much ease once we get into spring and the ground starts to thaw. For the US, for Western officials, as long as they can kick it down the road, even if there is no breakthrough, maybe a breakthrough comes later on. But for them, they feel like there is this window of danger that we are currently in. That could really be a high risk time for an invasion. And as long as we can get beyond that, even if there is no breakthrough, they'll do what they can do.
You mentioned Macron's shuttle diplomacy, and it is really interesting that he's really taken a lead on this. And I just recall Macron saying infamously that NATO is brain dead. He's been a loud advocate of what he calls the EU's strategic autonomy. But now it seems like he really is trying to step into the big man of Europe role that was vacant after Chancellor Merkel stepped to the side. So just your impressions of his recent moves and how he's really trying to elevate his stature as a statesman.
Well, there's a number of factors at play. I think a French official joked with me not too long ago that President Macron has bigger ambitions to be president of Europe. And, whether or not that's, the way that others might describe it, he definitely believes that he has an opportunity right now to take a lead, especially now that Chancellor Merkel has stepped away from her, from the chancellorship. Now, whether Chancellor Scholz is coming in and is still kind of trying to find his footing as the new chancellor of Germany, but also just in terms of NATO and EU presidencies, the way the cards fall. Macron also has an election coming up, which, again, remember that a lot of domestic issues kind of dominate a lot of moves that leaders play as well. And so that is probably factoring into a lot of his efforts as well. But, at the end of the day, France does believe, and probably rightfully so, that it does bear some responsibility because of the role that it assumed back in 2014, where it was going to shepherd these talks over the Donbass region. And those talks sort of flailed because there still remains this lingering controversy over control of the border in the Donbass region versus having elections in the region. And the order of which those two things happen is one of the issues that is very highly contested by both sides. And so President Macron trying even just to revive those talks. I mean, that's where we are. It's like we're just trying to get people to agree to talk. And it's not been going well. But, I think that France definitely has an opportunity here and is in a good position to take the lead on it. But what I hear from officials from all sides of this conflict is that for something to really happen, for something to a game-changing negotiation, talks, anything, the US needs to take a more forward-leaning role. And this is one of the criticisms that the Obama administration received in 2014, is that it kind of left the talks to the French and the Germans to take the lead. Because after all, it's their backyard. There's a lot of legitimacy to that argument of like, it's their backyard. It's not our conflict. It obviously impacts them a lot more than it impacts the United States. And so let them take the lead. But even the Ukrainians and a lot of European nations as well say, you know, those efforts failed. The Germans and the French really did not kind of hammer it home. And they believe that the only one that can really do that is Washington if it takes a genuine interest. But to this day, Washington, the Biden administration now persistently says, we support renewed Minsk talks, we support the Normandy process, but we will not get involved fully and lead that. And so it'll be interesting to see if that remains the case, and if so, whether or not any kind of efforts to revive those talks can be successful.
Yeah, and the parties for the Normandy format talks, they were meeting in Berlin just yesterday, I believe for over 9 hours. And that's the only, as far as I know, formal diplomatic fora where the Ukrainians and the Russians are in the same room talking to each other, talking past each other, shouting over each other, whatever. But yeah, it doesn't seem like there's much hope for that. 9.5 hours worth of talks, nothing really came of it, according to reporting. I do want to pivot to your most recent visit to Ukraine. We've got obviously dire warnings from the Pentagon that Russia has amassed significant combat power to take cities and substantial swaths of territory in Ukraine. Just what was the sentiment amongst the Ukrainian people? How are they preparing for a potential invasion? What's the feeling on the ground and in the air?
It depends who you ask. I mean, you're talking about a country with 45 million, I want to say, people. Everyone's got their own opinion. And what really interested me, and it was a question that I asked everywhere that I went when I traveled to the East included, is talking to some of these younger people who had never lived under Soviet rule, to see if their opinions were in any way different from those who knew what Russian, what Moscow's dominance over the country was like, the consequences of it, and just sort of where they've come since then. And the younger people I felt were a little bit more, they're nationalistic for sure, but they're also like not interested in a conflict. They certainly, in Kyiv especially, definitely do not want Russian rule. It's a mixed bag when you move to the East. But when I would ask them, are they concerned, and what's dominating their thoughts right now? It's the same thoughts that are dominating, somebody's thoughts here in Washington, D.C. or in New York. Like, who's going to win the football match? What movie are we going to see today? What's happening with my friends? And it was really interesting because on the one hand, I'm getting text messages, like my phone's blowing up the entire time I was there, from friends and family here in the US who are like, be careful, it's really dangerous out there. It sounds awful because they're listening to the US news. And over there, the message from the Ukrainian government and the kind of mood in the streets is like, keep calm, we got this. We know what this is about. We've been living through this for 8 years. And this is where things kind of get a little bit tricky, because you go there and you see everybody sort of believes that this is a status quo situation and that nothing has really changed. And you have the administration. I had some reporting earlier this week about President Biden and President Zelensky's last phone call, where President Zelensky pretty much told President Biden, you guys need to calm down. This is the same thing we've been experiencing for 8 years. And President Biden was like, there are troops in Belarus right at your border, 50 kilometers from your capital. That is serious. And you need to really kind of, embrace that this is a very different dynamic from what it's been over recent years. And so, but they're trying to maintain calm, in large part because they don't want to rile their economy. They don't want people rushing the banks. They don't want people fleeing the country. And so they're trying to really instill this sense of calm. And it does seem to be sinking in. There are people who are worried. There are people who are training now in volunteer military, like militias that have been absorbed officially with the military. I got to visit a couple of them, and they were a really interesting group of people. They called themselves the Weekend Army. But even when you go out to the East, and I'm talking about places now that are not sort of within the frontline areas, but are in the Donbass region or right at the border with Russia to the north, in a city called Kharkiv, which is the second largest city. You have this sense that, it's basically just another day. Russia looms large in that part of the country. People, the dominant language spoken to this day is Russian there, even as the rest of the country tries to shift toward embracing Ukrainian for all official purposes, its magazines, its newspapers, public speeches. In the East, they still speak Russian. A lot of them don't even speak Ukrainian that well. And it's a mixed bag, whoever you ask. And for them, it's like, well, if the Russians come, as long as it's not bloody, as long as it's not violent, whatever happens, happens. And it was really interesting to see. Of course, if an invasion happens, I'm sure that the temperature will change very quickly. And that's, I have to offer that disclaimer is that, everybody's speaking about something very hypothetical at the moment. And what their government is telling them is very different from what our government and the European governments are saying. And so it's no surprise that people are not running through the streets panicking, but that's pretty much the goal that they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and to what degree do you see that as being policymakers in Kyiv, the daylight between policymakers in Kyiv and policymakers in Washington and in London and in Paris, speaking to two different audiences, right? The Ukrainian political enterprise is trying to keep calm at home, not to rally markets, not to create panic in the street, whereas Western policymakers are trying to galvanize international support. So they're two almost, there's tension between those two desires.
They're not only trying to galvanize international support, they're trying to put Moscow on notice.
Right.
And that's what US officials keep telling me when I keep on saying, what's the goal here? The Ukrainians are begging you to stop going out there and calling attacks imminent, and saying that the country is basically in a dire place. And they say, we need Vladimir Putin to know that we know exactly what he's doing. We know where he's moving. We know what he's planning. They don't know what he's thinking. And they keep on saying that, nobody does. I'd be retired if I knew what Vladimir Putin was thinking, but, they want him to know that they can literally see everything that he's doing. And that's the tactic that they've taken. And so I keep on asking them, why do you do this publicly? Why not tell them privately and appease the Ukrainians who are also trying to keep calm? And they say that there's some leverage in kind of blasting them publicly. And so whether or not it works, we shall see. It's, that is the question, but that is the tactic that they've decided to take, of press them on it repeatedly as far as why they take this approach. And that's their justification.
I know it's hard to read into Putin's mind and know exactly what his next play is, but the Kremlin did release a set of demands in December on negotiating points and whatnot. Could you kind of hit on some of those high points? Obviously, one of them was never allowing Ukraine into NATO, but there were some other demands related to the broader European security architecture.
Right. I mean, and so this is like at the core of it, and it's definitely something that I've written about quite a bit, is that for all of the claims that the West has made about Russia's aggressive behavior, Russia also makes claims about aggressive Western behavior in terms of an expansion of NATO. And by expansion, they mean in the form of military aid and training to countries like Ukraine. They also talk about, this discussion of admitting, certain countries, specifically Ukraine and Georgia, into NATO, which is something that President Putin has said is a red line for him. And then he talks about military exercises in the eastern flank. And basically what he has repeatedly said and claimed is that any European military exercises is essentially a threat to his border. And that's what he keeps on saying is, there was a really interesting speech that he gave at an investment forum of all things, but then he got really dark in November, where he started talking about, once you have NATO in Ukraine, even if it's just in the form of like aid and weapons, a missile can hit Moscow in 5 minutes time. And that would be detrimental. And that would be the end of civilization. And can you imagine if this happens? And that's kind of what he tells his population is like, they are out to get us. And of course, the West comes out and says that is not true. And actually it's Russian aggression that is the problem. But these are the demands that he's laid out on the table. And so, obviously, as far as not admitting states like Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, they say that's a non-starter. They're not even going to go there. They say that even though they say that Ukraine and Georgia are probably a ways away, and especially Ukraine is a ways away from actually being admitted into NATO, they're not even about to entertain what Vladimir Putin thinks about who should and should not be a member of NATO. And so this is sort of the back and forth of where we are now. And the US actually says, one final point, the US actually says, there are actually areas with regard to European security that we can work on. that there are opportunities with regard to, you know, nuclear arms and things like that, that there really are, there is some wiggle room as long as it's done on a reciprocal basis. Then that's like the thing that they emphasize constantly is any of these talks, if we are even to start having them, need to be agreed upon first and foremost that this is a discussion about reciprocal moves. And we haven't even been able to get to that point yet because Moscow is so stuck on some of those points, which it calls the red line, the NATO involvement in Ukraine. Everything the West calls a non-starter. So it literally is a non-starter.
Let's talk a bit about the military balance and the state of the Ukrainian military. You had a great piece in the Journal, I believe it was last week, talking about how the Ukrainian military is much better armed than it was in 2014. So can you go and talk, can you unpack that a bit, and also a bit of the assistance that they've been receiving from the US, from the Brits, from others?
Yeah, I don't think I can rattle it all the assistants off the top of my head. Sadly, some of my colleagues probably could be better at that. But you know, the point of the story was that the military of 2014 and the government, by the way, of 2014 is not the government or the military of today. And that is in large part because after 2014, where so many Western nations, the US especially, just believed that they had such a missed opportunity with regard to the annexation of Crimea, that they did not act fast enough to be able to support Ukraine. They vowed that they would do so in the future to prop up the kind of pro-Western government that was installed after the Euromaidan protests of 13 and 14, and just help them to defend themselves, because obviously with a ongoing war in the Donbass region, and then the continued annexation of Crimea since then, they believe that the threat was indeed persistent for them, and so they've poured all kinds of weapons and support. One of the big ones, anti-tank. Right. Javelins was the big sticking point that a lot of administrations have sort of struggled with. The Obama administration decided it was not going to give them javelins. The Trump administration was reluctant, but then decided to give them javelins. And so that's been something that's been in our media for quite some time. Obviously, there's a whole kind of sidebar to the Trump administration and what happened with the military aid to Ukraine that we all remember and don't have to get into. But Joe Biden remember that he was vice president when all of this stuff went down in 2014. His book, Promise Me Dad, his memoirs, I was actually kind of astonished at how much Ukraine was in there. It is something that he really, really invested time and emotional energy into. And so it's something really important for him. But the bottom line is the US continues to be concerned about issues like corruption in Ukraine and other domestic challenges that are facing the president. And so, while they want to throw the kitchen sink at Ukraine and help them in any way they possibly can, it is always a little bit of a discussion because of the fact that the future is so uncertain when it comes to its government and the stability of its government and Russian efforts to penetrate and to destabilize that government. And so they're literally caught between a rock and a hard place, Ukraine, and they know that. They know that better than anyone else. And so they are better than they were in 2014. They are more capable of fending off the Russian military. But defeating the Russian military is going to always be a challenge for them and for a lot of other countries as well.
Wow, 30 minutes goes by extremely quickly, and you're chatting with one of the smartest national security reporters in Washington. But that is all the time we have. I know Vivian's got to run to go to a press briefing over at the White House, but I really appreciate you taking the time. I hope that we can bring you back at some point soon to tap into your expertise and your insights. Again, I thought this was a great conversation. We covered not nearly as much ground as I wanted to, but I think you did help us all get a greater understanding of what's going on.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, great. Thanks, Vivian. Really appreciate it. And if ASP can ever be